Dawn broke quietly over the Pacific. Japanese ground crews were preparing aircraft. Pilots adjusted goggles. Engines warmed under a rising sun that symbolized invincibility. Then the sky changed. Radar screens flickered. Anti-aircraft guns screamed to life. And within hours, flames swallowed airfields, carriers, and entire squadrons. By sunset, more than 400 Japanese aircraft were gone, destroyed in a single day. Not over months. Not over weeks. One day. It wasn't just a tactical loss. It was the moment Japan realized the war in the sky had shifted forever. And the empire would never recover its wings. The morning began like so many others in the vast theater of the Pacific War. Humid air clinging to metal fuselages, mechanics moving with rehearsed precision beneath rising sunlight, and pilots climbing into cockpits beneath the red disk of the imperial flag. Across multiple airfields stretching from the Marianas to the Philippines, Japanese aircraft stood in disciplined rows. Mitsubishi A6M0s, Nagma Ki-43 Oscars, Kawanishi N1K Sherdens. Sleek machines that had once ruled Asian skies without serious opposition. Veterans of Pearl Harbor. Conquerors of Malaya. Masters of early Pacific engagements. They had once been symbols of technological superiority and spiritual conviction. Lightweight, long-range fighters flown by highly trained aviators who believed surrender was dishonor and death was transcendence. But this morning was different. Far beyond the horizon, American carriers had repositioned. Massive task forces, steel islands bristling with radar arrays and anti-aircraft batteries, had silently crept within striking distance. On their decks, hundreds of aircraft were being armed simultaneously. Hellcats. Helldivers. Avengers. Machines heavier, faster, and now flown by pilots trained under a radically expanded U.S. aviation program. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not yet know that this day would become one of the most catastrophic air disasters in military history. They believed they were ready. They believed they still held parity in the air. They were wrong. The illusion of strength. By mid-1944, Japan's air power existed in two conflicting realities. On paper, they still possessed hundreds of aircraft across the Pacific. Replacement production continued, though increasingly strained by material shortages and relentless American submarine blockades. Aircraft factories operated under bombing threats. Fuel supplies were deteriorating. Pilot training hours had been slashed. Yet official briefings projected confidence. Commanders reassured one another that spirit could compensate for material inferiority. The Bushido ethos, self-sacrifice above all, remained central doctrine. Young pilots were trained faster, graduated sooner, and deployed earlier. What had once required years of training now required months. Experience was thinning. The Americans, meanwhile, had learned from early defeats. They had redesigned tactics. They had improved radar coordination. They had integrated fighter direction centers capable of intercepting enemy waves long before visual contact. More importantly, they had industrial supremacy. Where Japan struggled to replace a veteran pilot, America replaced entire air groups. Where Japan conserved fuel, America refined it in abundance. The balance was shifting, not gradually, but decisively. Radar warnings. Shortly after dawn, Japanese radar operators began detecting anomalies. Blips. Numerous. Expanding. At first, confusion. Perhaps reconnaissance flights. Perhaps fragmented signals. But the formation size grew rapidly. The scope filled. Incoming. Not dozens. Hundreds. Across multiple sectors, alarms sounded almost simultaneously. Air raid sirens wailed across airfields. Pilots sprinted toward aircraft. Ground crews scrambled to pull chocks free. Engines roared to life in chaotic synchronization. Some aircraft took off smoothly. Others stalled amid rushed procedures. Fuel lines had been hastily connected. Ammunition belts hurriedly loaded. The sky darkened, not from weather, but from formation density. American carrier groups had launched one of the largest coordinated air assaults of the Pacific War. And they were coming in waves. The first wave. The American strike doctrine was methodical. Fighters first. then dive bombers, then torpedo bombers. F6F Hellcats surged forward at higher altitudes, sweeping ahead to eliminate interceptors. Unlike earlier warfighters, the Hellcat was rugged, heavily armed, and forgiving. Its pilots benefited from extensive gunnery training and coordinated communication networks. Japanese fighters rose to meet them. Zeros climbed aggressively, attempting altitude advantage. But the engagement dynamics had changed since 1942. American pilots no longer engaged in turning dogfights where the Zero excelled. They used boom and zoom tactics, diving at high speed, firing concentrated bursts, then climbing away before counterattack. Within minutes, the sky fractured into streaking contrails and blossoming explosions. Japanese aircraft, lightly armored and lacking self-sealing fuel tanks in many variants, ignited easily under .50 caliber fire. One Zero spiraled downward trailing black smoke. Then another. Then three more. Radio chatter turned frantic. Requests for vector guidance. Calls for reinforcements. Reports of overwhelming numbers. Below, dive bombers screamed downward. Airfields became targets. Hangars erupted under precision strikes. Fuel depots detonated with concussive force. Aircraft still grounded were obliterated before takeoff. Entire squadrons were erased before entering combat. Collapse of coordination. Japanese command structures relied heavily on visual confirmation and decentralized engagement once combat began. American radar direction centers, by contrast, coordinated layered defense and offense. When the first wave inflicted heavy losses, Japan attempted to regroup and launch secondary formations from alternate airfields. But the Americans had anticipated that. Subsequent waves targeted those secondary bases. Runways were cratered. Repair crews killed mid-operation. Aircraft attempting emergency landings found no viable strips. The air battle transformed into a massacre. Pilots who survived initial engagement found themselves isolated, outnumbered, and often low on fuel due to rapid scrambling. Many were shot down attempting to disengage. Others crash-landed on damaged strips. Still others never returned at all. The psychological shock. By midday, Japanese observers began recognizing the scale of devastation. Columns of smoke rose from multiple installations simultaneously. Communications between sectors became fragmented. Reports were inconsistent, but the trend was unmistakable. Losses were catastrophic. The Imperial Navy had believed it could contest the skies. Instead, it was being systematically dismantled. The sheer numerical disparity stunned even seasoned officers. Wave after wave of American aircraft continued arriving, each coordinated with precision timing. The Japanese response became increasingly reactive rather than strategic. Young, undertrained pilots were thrown into battle against veteran American aviators flying superior aircraft. The outcome was predictable, but it was still devastating: the Turkey Shoot. American pilots would later describe the engagement with a grim, almost detached phrase. They called it a Turkey Shoot. Targets were abundant. Resistance was sporadic. In certain sectors, American pilots reported shooting down multiple aircraft within minutes. Some encountered inexperienced opponents who flew predictable attack patterns. Others observed Japanese pilots attempting desperate head-on charges. Bravery was not absent. Skill increasingly was. The attrition rate reached historic proportions. Aircraft destroyed in the air. Aircraft destroyed on the ground. Aircraft abandoned due to fuel shortages. By late afternoon, tally boards aboard American carriers began reflecting staggering numbers. Hundreds destroyed. Not exaggerated. Not estimated. Confirmed. The Japanese air arm, once the terror of the Pacific, was bleeding out in real time. Strategic implications. This was not merely a bad day. It was a structural collapse. Aircraft can be rebuilt. Pilots cannot be replaced quickly. Japan had already suffered heavy pilot losses earlier in the war at Midway and Guadalcanal. Training pipelines had shortened to unsustainable levels. Now, entire air groups were erased in hours. Even surviving aircraft faced fuel scarcity. Even surviving pilots lacked combat seasoning. The Americans, by contrast, rotated fresh crews, integrated combat experience into training doctrine, and continuously upgraded aircraft. The industrial imbalance translated directly into aerial dominance. As the sun began its descent, the scale of destruction became undeniable. Airfields smoldered. Wreckage littered coastlines. Rescue boats searched for survivors among oil-slicked waters. Commanders faced a reality few had anticipated. Japan had not merely lost a battle. It had lost control of the skies. Sunset over ruins. By dusk, the horizon glowed not with victory banners, but with fires. Over 400 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, airborne and grounded combined, within a single coordinated operational day. The number would reverberate through military channels. It represented more than machines. It represented years of training, institutional knowledge, offensive capability, future operations. The American fleet withdrew beyond immediate range, leaving devastation behind. And in the silence that followed the roar of engines, a realization settled over Japanese command. Air superiority, once ascent, was gone. Permanently. The empire that had once struck Pearl Harbor with surgical precision now faced an adversary that had mastered scale, coordination, and relentless production. The Pacific War had entered a new phase. One defined not by daring surprise, but by overwhelming force. And this single day would echo in the decisions that followed. Desperate strategies, defensive postures, and eventually, measures born of hopelessness. But that was yet to come. For now, smoke rose into a darkening sky. And Japan stood stunned. The destruction of more than 400 Japanese aircraft in a single day did not occur by accident. It was the product of converging forces, industrial, tactical, technological, and psychological, that had been building for years. What unfolded in the skies over the Philippine Sea in June 1944 was not merely a battle. It was a systemic collapse revealed under pressure. Historians would later frame it within the larger context of the Mariana Islands campaign. The United States had initiated Operation Forager, targeting Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands were not symbolic objectives, they were strategic keystones. From their airfields, American B-29 superfortresses could strike the Japanese home islands directly. For Tokyo, losing the Marianas was unacceptable. The Imperial Japanese Navy mobilized its remaining carrier strength in what it called Operation Ago. The objective was decisive engagement, lure the U.S. fleet into range, overwhelm it with coordinated airstrikes, and restore parity in the Pacific. On paper, the Japanese still possessed substantial air assets, carrier-based aircraft supplemented by land-based naval aviation units stationed across nearby island chains. In theory, they could launch hundreds of planes in successive waves. But theory and execution had diverged. The quality gap. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had once dominated Allied fighters through superior maneuverability and range. In 1941 and early 1942, its performance characteristics outclassed American aircraft such as the F4F Wildcat. By 1944, however, the equation had inverted. The American F6F Hellcat and F4U Corsair had been designed specifically to counter the Zero. They were faster in level flight, superior in dive speed, and far more durable. Self-sealing fuel tanks dramatically reduced catastrophic ignition. Armor plating protected pilots who would previously have perished from a single burst. Equally significant was pilot training. Pre-war Japanese naval aviators underwent an elite, grueling program. Attrition during training was high. Graduates were extraordinarily skilled. But that pipeline had been decimated at Midway and Guadalcanal. Replacement pilots entering service in 1944 often had fewer than half the flight hours of their predecessors. Gunnery training was abbreviated. Formation discipline was inconsistent. Combat experience was minimal. American pilots, meanwhile, benefited from a scalable training apparatus. Standardization, tactical doctrine refinement, and gunnery specialization were institutionalized. Radio coordination was emphasized. Carrier landing practice was extensive. The result was asymmetric proficiency. In dogfights over the Philippine Sea, this disparity manifested quickly. Japanese pilots frequently entered turning engagements, historically their strength. American pilots refused to comply. They attacked from altitude, executed high-speed firing passes, and disengaged before counterattack. Kill ratios widened. Radar as a force multiplier. Perhaps the most decisive variable was radar integration. American task forces operated layered radar detection networks. Early warning allowed fighter direction officers to vector interceptors precisely toward incoming formations. Japanese aircraft often flew long distances over open water before even sighting their targets. American interceptors met them dozens of miles from carrier groups. This distance mattered. Fuel calculations for Japanese strike aircraft were precise and unforgiving. Many launched at maximum operational range to reach American fleets. When intercepted early and forced into evasive maneuvers, fuel consumption spiked. Even aircraft that survived combat often lacked sufficient reserves to return to base. Some ditched at sea. Others attempted emergency landings on distant islands. Thus, attrition extended beyond direct shootdowns. Radar did more than detect. It structured the entire battle space. American fighters could engage in successive layers, retreat to rearm and refuel, and return to combat within hours. Japanese pilots flew a single extended mission. If they survived, the first major strike wave. On the morning of June 19, 1944, Japanese carriers launched approximately 370 aircraft in multiple waves aimed at the American Fifth Fleet. The composition included a 6M0's fighter escort, D-4Y Judy dive bombers, B-6N Jill torpedo bombers. The distances involved were extreme, over 300 miles in some cases. As formations advanced, American radar screens illuminated with incoming contacts. Fighter direction officers aboard carriers such as USS Lexington and USS Enterprise scrambled interceptors in structured waves. What followed would become infamous. American pilots later reported engagements where Japanese aircraft flew in loosely coordinated groups, often lacking tight defensive formations. Communication breakdowns were evident. Hellcats descended in coordinated sections. Within minutes, Japanese formations began fragmenting. Explosions dotted the sky. Pilots attempting torpedo runs were shot down before reaching release range. Dive bombers broke formation under pressure. Some pressed forward regardless, demonstrating extraordinary bravery, but tactical bravery could not compensate for systemic disadvantage. One American pilot recorded shooting down 5 aircraft in a single sortie. Such accounts were not isolated. By midday, the majority of the first strike wave had been destroyed. Few inflicted meaningful damage on American ships. The cost-exchange ratio was staggering. Land-based aviation destroyed. Simultaneously, American strikes targeted Japanese land airfields across Guam and Rota. These installations housed reserve aircraft intended to reinforce carrier operations. Instead, they became targets. Dive bombers cratered runways. Fighter strafing runs ignited parked aircraft. Fuel storage detonations compounded losses. Grounded aircraft, unable to disperse effectively, were annihilated. In some sectors, entire squadrons were eliminated before ever taking off. The integration of carrier and land-based assault amplified total destruction beyond the initial air-to-air engagements. By late afternoon, cumulative losses exceeded 300 aircraft. And the day was not over. Operational disintegration. Japanese commands struggled to reconcile incoming reports. Communications lagged. Situational awareness was fragmented. Pilots who survived engagements often returned to carriers with incomplete information. Fuel shortages intensified operational paralysis. Carrier decks, once crowded with strike aircraft, appeared conspicuously empty. The loss of experienced deck crews further degraded sortie generation capacity. Even worse, Japan could not replace carrier-qualified pilots quickly. Carrier aviation is a specialized discipline. Landing on a moving deck under combat conditions requires extensive practice. Those skills were vanishing. As daylight waned, American submarines added another dimension to catastrophe. USS Albacore and USS Kavala located and torpedoed Japanese carriers Taiho and Shokaku. Secondary explosions, exacerbated by volatile fuel vapors and damage control failures, sank both vessels. Aircraft aboard were lost with them. Thus, the day's destruction encompassed not only airborne losses but also carrier-borne aircraft eliminated by naval attrition. The systemic collapse was complete. The psychological fracture. Military defeats often carry delayed psychological consequences. This one was immediate. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the engagement believing it could still contest American naval air power. Instead, it encountered overwhelming integration, radar coordination, industrial redundancy, pilot proficiency, and layered defense. The term, Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, emerged among American aviators, not as mockery of courage, but as commentary on imbalance. For Japanese survivors, the experience was harrowing. Pilots reported skies filled with tracers, sudden structural failures from heavy-caliber impacts, and enemy fighters that could absorb return fire without disintegrating. Confidence eroded. The myth of qualitative superiority had shattered. Numerical accounting. By conservative estimates, over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down in aerial combat. Approximately 100 more were destroyed on the ground or lost operationally. 3 carriers were sunk over the broader engagement. Veteran pilot losses were irreplaceable. American losses were comparatively minimal, roughly 30 aircraft in air combat that day. The disparity ratio exceeded 10 to 1. In air warfare, such ratios are not merely tactical, they are transformative. Air superiority is cumulative. Once lost at scale, recovery becomes exponentially difficult. Japan would never again field carrier air groups of comparable size or quality. Subsequent reliance on kamikaze tactics reflected not fanaticism alone, but strategic desperation. Conventional parity was unattainable. Strategic consequences. The annihilation of Japanese air power during this engagement had cascading effects. Marianas secured, American forces consolidated control, enabling sustained B-29 bombing campaigns against Japan. Carrier doctrine dominance, U.S. naval aviation established uncontested operational superiority. Japanese defensive posture, offensive capacity deteriorated sharply, shifting strategic emphasis to homeland defense. Accelerated war trajectory, air dominance facilitated amphibious operations with reduced resistance. The Pacific War's trajectory was now irreversible. From this point forward, Japan fought defensively, reacting to American advances rather than shaping operational tempo. Sunset of an air arm. As night enveloped the Philippine Sea, scattered survivors navigated by instinct and fading instruments. Some pilots never found their carriers. Others landed on wrong decks. Many vanished into darkness. On Japanese carriers that remained afloat, deck space felt hollow. The once formidable air groups had been reduced to fragments. Messages transmitted to Tokyo were cautious but somber. Losses heavy. Operational capacity degraded. Strategic situation deteriorating. The empire had not collapsed in a single day, but its ability to project air power decisively had. More than 400 aircraft destroyed in one day represented not only mechanical loss, but the evaporation of accumulated experience spanning years. Aircraft factories could produce airframes. They could not manufacture veteran instincts. They could not compress years of aerial combat into weeks of training. They could not rebuild shattered doctrine overnight. The Pacific sky now belonged to the United States. And Japan knew it. When historians analyze turning points in war, they often look for singular moments, battles that fracture momentum, engagements that redraw the strategic map overnight. The destruction of more than 400 Japanese aircraft in a single day during the Battle of the Philippine Sea was one of those moments. But its significance was not fully visible at sunset. It revealed itself slowly, through absence, through silence, through empty flight decks. The silence after the engines. In the days following the battle, Japanese carrier groups withdrew westward. What had been envisioned as a decisive offensive maneuver had instead become a forced retreat. On surviving carriers like Zuikaku and Junyo, the flight decks were conspicuously barren. Where rows of aircraft once stood wingtip to wingtip, now there were gaps, large, unsettling gaps. Maintenance crews had fewer engines to inspect. Armorers had fewer bombs to load. Signal officers had fewer aircraft to marshal. The operational tempo had collapsed. A carrier without aircraft is not a weapon. It is merely a ship. Japan still possessed hulls. It no longer possessed the air groups to make them lethal, the irreplaceable loss. Industrial capacity was measurable. Pilot experience was not. Before the war, Japanese naval aviators underwent an elite training regimen that sometimes lasted several years. Only a fraction of candidates graduated. The result was a small, highly capable cadre. By mid-1944, that cadre had already been depleted. The Philippine Sea did not merely thin the ranks, it severed the institutional memory of carrier aviation. Veteran squadron leaders, carrier-qualified landing specialists, formation tacticians, gunnery instructors. Many were gone in hours. Japan attempted to accelerate pilot production afterward. Training was shortened further. Standards were lowered again. But accelerated training yields predictable results. New pilots lacked advanced formation discipline. They had limited instrument experience. Their gunnery accuracy was inconsistent. Carrier landing proficiency was marginal. The qualitative decline was irreversible. Air power is not only hardware. It is skill multiplied by coordination. And that equation had broken. Strategic dominoes. The consequences unfolded in sequence. First, the Marianas fell. With air superiority uncontested, American forces secured Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Airfields were rapidly constructed and expanded. Then came the B-29 superfortresses. From these newly captured islands, long-range strategic bombing missions against the Japanese home islands became feasible. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, cities once beyond reach, now lay within operational radius. The loss of 400 aircraft did not directly cause the bombing of Japan, but it removed the ability to prevent it. Second, Japanese naval aviation ceased to function as an offensive arm. Future engagements would reveal a shift in posture. Rather than projecting power, Japan increasingly sought to delay American advances. Carrier battles as symmetrical contests were over. Third, defensive desperation intensified. Without conventional air superiority, Japanese planners confronted a stark reality. If trained pilots were insufficient and aircraft quality inferior, how could momentum be slowed? The answer emerged later in 1944. Kamikaze operations. From elite aviators to one-way missions. It is tempting to view kamikaze tactics as purely ideological expressions of fanaticism. That interpretation is incomplete. Kamikaze strategy arose from operational necessity. When pilot training pipelines cannot produce veterans fast enough. When aircraft cannot survive dogfights against superior fighters. When fuel shortages limit training hours. When radar-guided interception guarantees attrition. Then conventional strike doctrine collapses. The destruction at the Philippine Sea accelerated that collapse. If a pilot cannot reliably penetrate layered defense and return, command reasoning shifted. Maximize damage potential in a single, irreversible strike. Thus, the same nation that once fielded some of the most disciplined naval aviators in the world began preparing young men for one-way missions. It was not confidence. It was acknowledgement of strategic inferiority. The American perspective. For the United States, the battle validated years of doctrinal evolution. Carrier task force integration. Radar-directed fighter interception. Standardized training. Industrial overproduction. Damage control protocols. The engagement demonstrated that American naval aviation had matured into a fully integrated system. Even more critically, it proved sustainability. Aircraft losses were replaced. Pilots rotated. Fuel flowed. The United States could fight large-scale air battles repeatedly. Japan could not. That asymmetry defined the final year of the Pacific War. The human dimension. Statistics often obscure the human cost. 400 aircraft destroyed does not merely signify metal debris scattered across sea and sand. It signifies hundreds of young men, many barely beyond adolescence, lost in flame or swallowed by open ocean. It signifies families who would receive sparse notifications, squadrons erased from rosters, photographs left on carrier bunks, flight logs ending mid-entry. For American pilots, victory carried its own psychological burden. Several later reflected not on exhilaration, but on the disturbing imbalance. They described enemy aircraft falling like rain. They described engagements where resistance seemed tragically inadequate. They described the sky as crowded with targets. In warfare, overwhelming superiority can feel less like triumph and more like inevitability. The final strategic arc. After the Philippine Sea, Japan's ability to contest airspace diminished steadily. Leyte Gulf followed, then Iwo Jima, then Okinawa. Each campaign reflected widening disparity. American forces operated under near-constant air cover. Japanese defenses relied increasingly on suicide attacks and ground fortifications. The loss of that single day, over 400 aircraft, did not alone end the war. But it closed a chapter. From Pearl Harbor to early Pacific expansion, Japan had demonstrated initiative, surprise, and air coordination. After the Philippine Sea, initiative belonged permanently to the United States. By 1945, strategic bombing intensified. Naval blockades strangled supply lines. Oil reserves evaporated. And in August 1945, after atomic detonations and Soviet entry into the war, Japan surrendered. The path to surrender was complex and multifaceted. Yet the air superiority that made sustained pressure possible traced directly back to moments like June 19, 1944. Moments when one side lost the sky. The end of illusion. Perhaps the most profound impact of that day was psychological. Until then, many within Japanese command still believed a decisive naval engagement might reverse momentum. The destruction of 400 aircraft in a single day shattered that belief. It revealed that industrial scale, radar integration, and standardized training had redefined modern warfare. Courage alone could not overcome systemic imbalance. Aircraft without fuel are static. Pilots without hours are vulnerable. Carriers without air groups are inert. The empire of the rising sun had risen on the wings of aviation innovation and daring surprise. It began to fall when those wings were torn away. A sky that never returned. In the years after the war, surviving Japanese aviators reflected on the Philippine Sea with quiet gravity. Some described it as the day they knew the war was lost. Not politically, not officially, but operationally. Because when the sky no longer belongs to you, every ship is exposed, every island vulnerable, every city reachable. Air superiority is not just a tactical advantage. It is strategic destiny. And on that single day, when more than 400 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, the destiny of the Pacific War became clear. The sun still rose over the ocean the next morning. But for Japan's naval air arm, it never rose the same way again.